in the middle of the Valley of Mexico, built upon the waters and dazzling with its towering structures and massive temples. Tenochtitlan was one of the most magnificent metropolises in the world. The Aztec Empire was a proud civilization that transformed marshes into engineering marvels, worshipped the skies, and combined its wealth with art. However, in November 1519, ironclad strangers appearing on the ocean horizon would descend like a nightmare upon this immense civilization. This was the beginning of one of history's most dramatic and bloody invasion stories, where two different worlds and faiths collided. In 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés set foot on the Mexican coast with just a few hundred soldiers, horses, and cannons. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma initially mistook these strangers for the returning god Quetzalcoatl, welcoming them with lavish gifts. However, the true aim of Cortés and his men was to seize legendary gold and usurp the lands in the name of the King of Spain. This goodwill and misunderstanding marked the beginning of the end for the Aztecs. Spanish greed and the violence inflicted upon the indigenous people soon triggered a major uprising. Following the death of Montezuma at the hands of his own people, the Aztecs drove the Spaniards out of the capital. Hundreds of Spaniards were killed on this night, known in history as La Noche Triste, the sad night. However, Cortés managed to escape and, gathering local allies, the Tlaxcalans, prepared anew to besiege Tenochtitlan. An invisible weapon brought by the Spaniards was far deadlier than swords and cannons: smallpox. Rapidly spreading among the non-immune Aztec population, the epidemic decimated a large portion of the empire's population. Even before the war began, thousands of lives were lost and armies were weakened. This biological devastation became the greatest factor making the Spanish victory inevitable. In 1521, the Spaniards and their indigenous allies besieged Tenochtitlan from three sides. The city's water routes were cut off, and food supplies were halted. In months of fierce street combat, the Aztecs fought to their last breath. The city streets filled with corpses, and temples were razed to the ground. When the last Aztec emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured, the magnificent Tenochtitlan was nothing more than a smoking ruin. Upon the ruins of the Aztec Empire, the colony of New Spain was established. The Spaniards built their own cathedrals using the stones of Aztec temples. The indigenous population was enslaved, forced to work to death in fields and silver mines. Aztec codices and religious texts were burned, and native culture and religion were systematically erased. Centuries of Spanish colonial rule accumulated immense anger between the indigenous population and locally born Spaniards, Creoles. On September 16, 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo rang the church bells in the town of Dolores, calling the people to rebellion. Known as the Cry of Dolores, this event ignited the Mexican War of Independence. The people launched guerrilla warfare in the mountains and valleys against the colonial administration. The War of Independence, lasting from 1810 to 1821, was extremely bloody. Father Hidalgo and the leaders who followed him were executed, but the struggle did not stop. Hundreds of thousands of Mexicans lost their lives in the war, led by commanders such as Vicente Guerrero and Agustín de Iturbide. The country was economically exhausted, cities were destroyed, but the desire for freedom remained unquenched. By 1821, Spanish forces could no longer control the country. With the signing of the Treaty of Córdoba, Spanish colonial rule officially came to an end. The Spanish flag was lowered, and Mexico emerged onto the world stage as an independent empire, later a republic. The conquerors departed these lands in defeat, just as they had arrived centuries before. In the autumn of 1821, the streets of Mexico filled with the euphoria of a new nation where millennia of Aztec heritage blended with Spanish culture. Independence celebrations lasted for days. Reborn from its ashes, the Mexican people took their destiny into their own hands. The story of Mexico proved how a people could rise again through resistance after the tragic collapse of an empire. But when we move from the ancient pyramids to the shores of the Nile River, what struggle for freedom was being waged in the shadow of the empire on which the sun never sets? In our next video, we will witness the epic of independence in Egypt, in the shadow of the Suez Canal and the pyramids. Stay tuned.